Thanks, Kshantikara. Very clear, relaxed, friendly man. Yeah, so good to see you all. I can kind of see you all. So good to see you all. I hope you're enjoying yourselves, that you're happy to be here. Are you happy to be here? Yes. Good. I'm happy to be here as well. Yeah, so giving a talk is probably not the ideal way to communicate, because it's like a monologue, isn't it? I do all the talking, you just have to listen. It's much better when I can ask you a question just like that, and you all hopefully not give exactly the same answer every time. But if I could sit down with all of you and just individually have a conversation or a communication, what sort of question would I ask you? I mean, I might ask you, what's your name, where you come from, have you been here before, all of that stuff. But maybe, seeing as how we're on a Buddhist retreat and so on, I might ask you, why are you here? Why are you here? What brought you here? And I don't know, you probably lots of different answers. We heard some of the answers last night in those little groups we met in. We heard people saying, well, I heard people saying things like, oh, my friend has been on retreat, and so I wanted to try it out, or various things like that. I can't remember what the other ones were. Somebody was doing yoga and they wanted to move beyond yoga, and so on. So people have different answers to those kind of questions. But what I'm thinking is actually we shouldn't be satisfied with the first answer we give to a question. We should always follow it up with another question. I'm talking about asking ourselves questions. We should always ask ourselves more questions. Because what we're trying to do is to go deeper into ourselves. We're trying to get to know ourselves much better. And one of the best ways of doing that is to ask ourselves questions, to find out about ourselves, find out what motivates us, find out, what we really think, what we really feel, and so on. I think it's asking questions that really leads to wisdom, to self-knowledge and wisdom. In a way, the answers are not so important. The questions are much more important. It's a bit like being a small child. We know what small children are like. They ask a question, you give an answer, they ask another question. You give an answer, they ask another question. And they just keep on doing that, don't they? Why does the ball bounce? Because it's rubber. Before you know it, you're into a conversation about international trade and imperialism, and well, who knows? And that's just a 5-year-old. Yeah. So that sort of curiosity is something we should bring to ourselves. That sort of curiosity where we just keep asking questions. So it's questions like, what's really important to you? What are your highest values? What's central in your life? What's your life for? Well, even more fundamental, what is life for? What's the point? Yeah, questions like that. I'm sure all of you have probably asked yourself something like that at some time. It's quite common, especially when we're teenagers or in our 20s, where we ask ourselves, what's life for? What's the point of life? I certainly asked myself those questions. I think most of my teenage years in my 20s were taken up with questions like that. So the title of this talk, as Kshantikara said, is Turn Your Mind to Going for Refuge. So this phrase, going for refuge, is one response, you could say, to the question, what is the point of life? Or what's the purpose of life? So Padmasambhava, the guru Padmasambhava, was invited by Queen Nangchong to come to her shrine, basically, and to give her some advice. She wanted advice. And his advice was, pay urgent attention to impermanence. Turn your mind. Actually, he says, strongly turn your mind to going for refuge. And what was the other one? Something about the prayers of the lamas. Direct your prayers to the lamas. So I'm just going to concentrate on this going for refuge. To begin with, going for refuge is obviously a metaphor. We have here the metaphor of refuge or shelter, or even escape, that kind of metaphor. But the question is, refuge from what? Shelter from what? In this context, refuge is something you can place your trust in, something that won't disappoint. Or to change the metaphor, refuge is something you can stand on, something strong you can stand on without falling through, something that can support you fully. So shelter, escape, refuge. We look for refuges of one kind or another all the time. We seek refuge from loneliness, from unhappiness, from feelings of insecurity, from boredom, from depression, from worries, from anxieties, from existential fear even. We try to escape these things. And of course, we're right to do so. It would be perverse not to try to escape or not to try to find shelter from life's storms. And where do we go? Where do we go for refuge from these things? Where do we go for shelter? In what way do we try to escape? Where do we look for happiness? Where do we look for satisfaction? Where do we look for meaning? Where do we look for purpose? There's a Buddhist text called the Dhammapada. It's one of the oldest Buddhist texts. And in there, the Buddha is saying, he says, many people, out of fear, flee for refuge to sacred hills, woods, groves, and shrines. In reality, this is not a safe refuge. In reality, this is not the best refuge. Fleeing to such a refuge, one is not released from all suffering. So that was ancient India. I wonder, what is our equivalent of the sacred hills, the groves, the woods, the shrines? What's our equivalent? What do we flee for refuge to? I guess we flee for refuge to relationships, maybe to wealth, maybe to status, maybe to careers. We put our trust perhaps in money or power or success, or we place our trust in family or travel, or we look for excitement and stimulation to escape from things. We try to blot it out with alcohol or drugs, or we get obsessed with sex or music or social media or whatever. So we look in all sorts of places for a sense of well-being, for a sense of satisfaction and happiness. We look in all sorts of places. We look in all sorts of places for some sense of purpose and meaning. And as I said, it would be quite perverse if we didn't try to find some way of coping with the existential facts of life and the incidental dissatisfaction and unhappiness that life throws up. So according to Buddhism, the problem is not that we seek refuge from life's storms, but that we look in all the wrong places. The things we look to cannot give any ultimate satisfaction. That's the problem. And they will only lead to disappointment. They can't lead to contentment, they can't provide meaning, they can't provide purpose in the face of the existential facts of old age, sickness, and death. So we place too much trust in these, what you might call mundane refuges, mundane ways of escaping. In a way, we could say we substitute escapism for escape. we mistake escapism for escape. And the Buddhist position, quite simply, is that we need to embark on a path of spiritual training. And that a path of spiritual training that will enable us to experience or to inhabit higher states of consciousness. So we need something that can satisfy our deepest yearnings, our deepest spiritual need. So what are the refuges, the shelter? What is the shelter recommended by the Buddha or recommended by Padmasambhava, the Indian sage Padmasambhava, who took Buddhism to Tibet? When Padmasambhava says, turn your mind to going for refuge, what does he mean? What refuge or refuges does he have in mind? And what does it mean to turn your mind? How do you turn your mind? So in Buddhism, the refuges are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. I'll explain those. So the Buddha, what does it mean that the Buddha is a refuge? Are we talking about a man who lived in India 2,500 years ago? Yes and no. The historical Buddha, Gautama, was the source of the tradition, and he's revered as the source of Buddhism, the source of all the teachings. But the Buddha also represents that which human beings are capable of. He represents the highest of which that human beings are capable of. The word Buddha, as you probably most of you will know, means one who is awake. And what the Buddha has woken up to is that there is no solution to the human existential dilemma on the level of ordinary everyday experience. The answer is to be found in a realization that comes about through following a spiritual discipline, a training, a path. And then the second refuge, the Dharma, that represents two things, you could say. It represents this reality or truth or wisdom which was realized by the Buddha, and it is also the path or the way to the higher and higher states of consciousness. So the Dharma is the path to awakening or the path to realization. And what the Dharma is in effect saying is that we can all become Buddhas. We can all become awakened ones, yeah? And that is the refuge. We can all realize the highest human potential. Then the third refuge, the Sangha. The Sangha is the community. It's the community of all those who have realized, or at least realized to some degree, for the truth for themselves. And it also represents the fact that there is no need to rediscover the path, because we can rely on those who have gone before us. And this whole being able to rely on those who have gone before us, this is what spiritual friendship is about. It's about learning from those who've gone before us, learning from example, learning through being in contact with those who have a deeper realization, or at least more experience than we have. And spiritual friendship is, by the way, a key to the whole point of life. So these three refuges, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, they're known as the three jewels in Buddhism. And they can satisfy our deepest yearnings, our deepest spiritual needs. They can answer the questions of meaning and purpose. Now, the truth of existence is not Buddhist. The Buddha didn't invent or create the truth. The truth is the truth, regardless of whether anyone realizes it or not. Regardless of whether anyone awakens to reality, reality is reality. What the Buddha has done is point out the way to us. He, or his teachings, are sometimes said to be the finger pointing to the moon. The Buddha realized the truth, which means he came to embody it. And then he has laid out the path by which others also can come to realize or embody the truth. So the Buddha's wisdom consists in his realization of the truth of existence, and his compassion is manifested through his teachings. So his compassion led him to endeavor to pass on to others what he had discovered. And this wisdom and compassion, which are identical as far as Buddhism is concerned. You cannot have wisdom without compassion. You cannot have compassion without wisdom. This wisdom and compassion is the highest goal of Buddhist practice. So to go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha means to accept that there is a principle or a law of reality, a truth that we are not yet conscious of, and which we want to realize fully and embrace and embody for our own sake and the sake of others. And going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, we're also accepting that Gautama the Buddha and many others since then have realized this truth, that the teachings of Buddhism communicate this realization and show us the path to awakening. And the Sangha refuge reminds us that we need other people. We need other people for guidance and mutual support, as we will all discover if we embark on the path. So, going for refuge then comes to mean undertaking a spiritual training. So that's what Padmasambhava is advising Queen Nang Chung. And this is a training in ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And it's in order to realize for ourselves the truth which the Buddha awoke to. It could be spoken of also as well as a training. You could speak of it as a commitment to a spiritual path, a commitment to our training, I suppose. Or we might say that going for refuge means placing our spiritual training, our spiritual path at the center of our lives. Our spiritual quest becomes the thing which is at the center of our lives. And everything else is then seen in terms of how it helps or hinders on the path. Yeah. It's probably worth noting, by the way, that the phrase is going for refuge. In this little translation here, it says taking refuge, but that's wrong. That's a wrong translation. It's going for refuge. And going is an active verb, yeah? It's something you do, not something that happens to you, but something you do. Buddhism is active. Buddhism requires energy. It requires energy, it requires determination, it requires persistence through ups and downs. Just like any journey, you have to persist and you have to take the rough with the smooth. So it's not just thinking about the path or admiring the path or yearning or wishing or waiting. It's not even about building or constructing the path. It's about getting going, setting out and keeping on. The American poet David Whyte, I don't know if you've heard of David Whyte, but he gives a little advice in one of his poems which is relevant here. He says, start close in Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing. Close in the step you don't want to take. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing. I think he's saying not that there is a second or a third step, but that the step we need to take is always the first step. So whether we're right at the beginning of our, as it were, spiritual quest or spiritual career, or whether we're many, many years or decades into it, the next step is the first step for us, yeah? And often it's the step, as he says, you don't want to take. There's some resistance to that next step. So yes, the path we're talking about is the path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And the path of ethics involves trying to live your life in accordance with ethical principles. And those ethical principles in Buddhism are non-violence, generosity, contentment, truthfulness or honesty in communication, and mindfulness or awareness. And if we were to say those in terms of what not to do, it would be don't harm any living thing. Don't take what you're not given. Don't coerce or manipulate people, especially for sexual gratification. Don't be untruthful or dishonest in your communication. And don't get so intoxicated that you become unmindful or unaware. Often when people first encounter a committed Buddhist, the first thing they want to know is, what are you not allowed to do? Yeah? What are you not allowed to do? So the hidden assumption, as it were, in this question is that there is some authority, yeah? Some authority such as a deity or a pope or something like that, who lays down the rules and the rest of us obey them. But it's not like that at all. There is no authority, yeah? The ethical precepts and principles of Buddhism are advice. Just like Padmasambhava was giving advice to Queen Nanchong, the Buddha gives advice. You could say the Buddha gives advice to humanity. And his advice is live by these principles, live by these ethical precepts. But we're free to take that advice or not. There's no compulsion. In fact, compulsion of that kind would be considered unethical in Buddhism. So the advice is, if you want to have a happy and satisfying life, you'll need to make some effort to live by these principles. And the terms used in Buddhism for right and wrong behavior are skillful and unskillful, which indicates that being ethical is a skill, a capability, something we can develop. It's a matter of intelligence, not obedience. And it's a training. Ethics is a training, it's a training. So you cannot expect yourself to be immediately perfect, or even to immediately fully understand the implications of these precepts. The ethical life in Buddhism is a training that you have to decide, you for yourself have to decide to undertake and practice. Just the same as if you want to be a runner or a swimmer or a musician, you have to undertake the training and put in the effort. And with time, you improve and have a better grasp of what you're doing. And a better grasp also of what conditions you need in order to improve further. I could talk at length about the 5 precepts or the 5 ethical precepts of Buddhism, partly because when I first encountered Buddhism, I encountered in the form of a Buddhist monk, a Sri Lankan monk whom I met in Berlin many years ago. And what he taught me was the 5 precepts. He also taught me the Metta Bhavana, which I didn't understand at all and never practiced. But I was very, very taken with the 5 precepts. I immediately, intuitively had this sense of how profound and pragmatic these 5 precepts or 5 ethical principles were. And I can say that these ethical principles have been at the heart of my Buddhist practice ever since. But I won't go on about the 5 precepts anymore. So that's the first training. We're talking about the training in ethics, meditation, and wisdom. The next training is in meditation. I'm not going to talk about this really. Vajratara, who's here somewhere, is doing meditation workshops every day. So I won't say much here. Although I would just like to say, again, this is a bit more personal. I'd like to say that meditation is not the whole of Buddhism. And even if you find meditation difficult, you can still be a perfectly good and effective Buddhist. Yeah? And that's my own experience. Yeah? I never found meditation easy. And sometimes when I was starting out on my Buddhist life, I used to despair. I used to despair that I could never meditate and I could never be a proper Buddhist. But I persisted, and I think I can assure you that you can make progress on the path, even if meditation seems difficult to you. But fortunately, for most people, it's not difficult. For most people, it's actually quite straightforward and enjoyable. So just go to Vajratara's workshop on meditation for more guidance. And just to say, like ethics, meditation is something you do and carry on doing. It's more important to be a regular meditator than to have any special, wonderful cosmic experiences. It's more important just to do it regularly. It's a training again. It's a way of training your mind. Then the last stage of training is training in wisdom. Sometimes the Buddhist tradition talks about this in terms of listening, reflecting, and meditating. And listening means learning. So we learn by hearing others speak, or by reading, or through study and discussion. And this stage is, of course, very important if you're interested in living a Buddhist life. It's the stage of finding out what the teachings actually say. And we learn, of course, by being receptive to those who know more and who are more experienced. I think actually that's probably what direct your prayers to the lamas is about. It's about being receptive. We also learn through repetition. Repetition means staying with a teaching until we've grasped it, and not getting distracted by all the other interesting looking teachings, or all the other interesting looking books, or all the other interesting looking teachers, and so on. As David Whyte says, don't take the second step or the third, start with the first thing. And as regards wisdom, the first thing is learning. Another reason you could say why it's not worth going all over the place looking at teachings is because, in a way, the whole of the Dharma is present in every teaching. So the whole of the Dharma is present in the precepts, for instance. You could spend your lifetime working out what they mean and their implications. Then the second stage of wisdom training is reflecting. So we had listening, now we have reflecting. Reflecting is about going deeper into the significance of the teachings. And they're going deeper into the implications of the teachings for our life. So by reflecting, we make the teachings our own. Gradually, we become kind of imbued with them. And of course, asking questions, which I referred to at the beginning, is one of the ways of reflecting and not settling for superficial answers. And then the last stage of the wisdom training is sometimes called meditation. But what it's really about is about embodying the teachings. This is what realization means. Realization means making real in your everyday experience. It's the lived experience of truth or reality. And that lived experience is always expressed compassionately. It is compassion. So the wisdom aspect of training involves being receptive, reflecting deeply, and finally becoming or realizing or embodying what we have learnt and understood. So in practical terms, if we're serious about following a spiritual path, we need 4 things in particular. So we need to live by the ethical values of non-harm, generosity, contentment, honesty, and awareness. Secondly, we need to set aside time for our meditation, meditation and reflection, you could say, regular time every day, if possible. Thirdly, we need friends. We need friends who are also on the path, friends who can help us with, help us with the ethical dimension of practice, but just help us generally, just through our communication with them. It's mutually supportive. And then, fourthly, we need to go on retreat from time to time. So those are the 4 things that we need. And if we can set up these conditions, we'll make progress. In fact, we'll make progress quite quickly. In Triratna, of course, we have Buddhist centers where you can go to learn more. We have a 3-year study program, study course for those who really want to learn more. We have ordination, of course, for those who want to fully commit themselves to a Buddhist life. We also have different retreat centers and many different kinds of retreat. And retreats are important because it's in those more focused and intense conditions that most people go deeper and understand and experience more clearly what the Buddhist path of training is about. And it's also, of course, on retreats often where we make friends. We make friends with people who are on the same wavelength, so to speak. So I've been speaking about the path, but this, the metaphor of a path could be misleading. It suggests something separate from us. So perhaps it's better to use a more organic metaphor, like growth. Yeah. If we speak of spiritual growth, it's more clear that we are changing. We are transforming. Whereas the image of a path might suggest that we can progress on the path and remain the same. So coming back to the title of the talk, Turn Your Mind to Going for Refuge, we could say that what is being advised is that we turn our minds towards the ideas and methods and practices of spiritual growth and development. Maybe it's worth looking at what it means to turn your mind towards something. What does it mean to turn your mind, and how can we turn our minds? So in Buddhism, mind is primary, and it's fundamental to the whole training and practice. It's fundamental that we can shift the focus of our attention. If it wasn't possible to shift the focus of our attention, then the whole Buddhist project would be impossible. So to turn our minds means to shift the focus of our attention deliberately, consciously. And in order to turn your mind to anything, there needs to be interest. If you're not interested in something, you're unlikely to make any effort to turn your mind towards it. If there is interest in, for instance, in spiritual growth, then in order to turn our minds in that direction, we need to practice mindfulness. We need to practice mindfulness of our thoughts, mindfulness of our emotions, mindfulness of our responses, mindfulness of our motivations. And we need to gradually develop an awareness of what our mind is actually dwelling on. What direction does our mind take habitually? Sometimes it's easier to discover what our mind is really interested in by looking at what we do. So, for instance, if we observe more closely what we do with our time, or even with our money, in what way do we spend our time? In what way do we spend our money? This tells us a lot about ourselves. It tells us a lot about what we're really interested in, what motivates us. And it can provide a starting point for awareness of our minds. So again, it's a case of start close in. Start with the first thing, close in, the step you don't want to take. If we find that our mind is habitually turned in a direction that's not helpful to spiritual growth, then we will have to make some effort to turn towards what is helpful. And I've already mentioned the things that can support us to turn our minds in a more creative and helpful direction. The four things: meditation, which helps us to know our minds more thoroughly by bringing awareness to the tendency of our minds. We can gradually and gently transform ourselves. Then going on retreat helps us to go deeper and gain more understanding and self-knowledge. Good communication with other people is supportive, but particularly other people who also want to grow and develop spiritually. That helps us to stay on the track. It needs to be people who are on the same wavelength and who also want to grow spiritually, because otherwise misunderstandings arise very quickly. So a bunch of friends that you go down the pub with or play tennis with or whatever may not be on the same wavelength and may not know what you're on about if you're talking about the precepts or something like that. And then the fourth thing, the ethical values in the Buddhist precepts, they give us a very practical, a very down-to-earth guidance about how to live our lives in a way that's conducive to spiritual growth. So the advice of Padmasambhava is clear enough. Focus your attention as much as you can on growing spiritually, or to put it another way, get on the spiritual path and stay on it. The American poet, another American poet, Walt Whitman, probably many of you know Walt Whitman. He had a lot to say about what he called the open road, which we could see as a metaphor for the spiritual path. So he says, for instance, afoot and light-hearted, I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me, leading wherever I choose. Henceforth, I ask not good fortune. I myself am good fortune. Henceforth, I whimper no more, postpone no more, need nothing, done with indoor complaints, libraries, querulous criticisms. Strong and content, I travel the open road. I love Walt Whitman. In another poem, he says, each man and each woman of you I lead upon a knoll, my left hand hooks you round the waist, my right hand points to landscapes and continents and a plain public road. Not I, not anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it for yourself. It is not far, it is within reach. Perhaps you've been on it since you were born and did not know. Perhaps it is everywhere, on water and on land. Shoulder your duds and I will mine, and let us hasten forth. So perhaps that's what I've been trying to do in this talk. Perhaps I've been trying to point to landscapes and continents and a plain public road and tell you you must travel it for yourself. I've been on this journey for over half my life, and it has given meaning and purpose to me and it's transformed me. And I have absolutely no hesitation in recommending it to you. At the same time, I want to issue a little warning, or maybe it's a kind of challenge. Depends on how you take it. If you seriously take up Buddhist practice, meditation, ethics, reflection, communication, going on retreats, all of that, it will have a profound effect on you, and it will change you. It can turn you upside down and inside out. And at times it can be uncomfortable. Fortunately, it's also deeply satisfying. The Swiss-American psychiatrist, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, some of you may have heard of her, she wrote a book called On Death and Dying, which was a very important work when it was published in 1969. It broke a kind of taboo in talking about, very openly about the experience of dying. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross worked with dying people for many years, and based her experiences, based on those experiences, she came up with a model of the 5 stages of grief that people go through when they're dying. But one other thing that came out of her work with dying people, spending so much time with people at the very end of their life, she came up with the answer, as it were, to what is the point of life? What is the purpose of life? And she stated it very simply. She said, spiritual growth is the sole purpose of life here on earth. Spiritual growth is the sole purpose of life here on earth. When the Guru Padmasambhava gives his advice to Queen Nangchong, he says, turn your mind to going for refuge. And what he means could perhaps be more simply put as spiritual growth is the sole purpose of life here on earth. Not I, not anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it for yourself. It is not far, it is within reach. Perhaps you've been on it since you were born and did not know. Perhaps it is everywhere, on land and on water. Shoulder your duds, and I will mine, and let us hasten forth.